You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hardtalk. Pranks. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme, and I hope you enjoy it. Gene Sharp is a political thinker whose influence is now spoken of in the same breath as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. But he's no platform speaker or figurehead at a demonstration. Rather, a quietly spoken political philosopher who's been writing about non-violent struggle for 50 years. What's changed is that his most celebrated pamphlet, From Dictatorship to Democracy, is now grabbing attention around the world. He's been hailed as having helped mould protest movements from Burma to Serbia to Egypt. What is it that he's been able to unlock? Gene Sharp, welcome to Hardtalk.
Thank you very much.
You've been described as the man who changed the world. Do you recognise that description?
I haven't heard exactly that one. I think
it was from your local newspaper, the Boston Globe.
Yeah, but things get exaggerated a bit.
You don't think that you've had that level of influence?
I know there's been some influence on my writings. It's always hard to judge, particularly for myself to do the judging. That kind of thing maybe should be judged a few years ahead.
Well, certainly your most celebrated pamphlet, From Dictatorship to Democracy, it has been translated into dozens of languages.
34.
Tell me about the genesis of it. Where did it come from?
I had been meeting with some of the Burmese Democrats, occasionally inside Burma illegally, and occasionally in Thailand or elsewhere in the U.S. perhaps.
This was back in the early 90s?
Yes. And one of the men was Tin Mao Win, who was a Burmese Democrat in exile, principally in Thailand, but also in the U.S. He was editing a new journal called Kipian, or New Era Journal in English. And he asked me to write for it and gave me free rein to write for something for Burma. But the problem was I didn't know Burma in depth, but I had been studying dictatorships and nonviolent struggle for decades. So I had manuscripts and rough drafts and notes and other things I had to draw on. So I pulled some of those together. At that time, we had money, so I could have a full-time assistant for working on that only. And we worked for 4 months still and put a draft together. And then that was what was published. And when it was published in Bangkok, not in the U.S., I thought, well, that was it. We did get it translated into 4 other languages of Burma beside Burmese. But I thought that was it.
But then it became a pamphlet that was used and translated across. I mean, if we map some of the major revolutions, major changes that there have been in recent decades, I mean, it's been translated into Ukrainian, into Serbian, into Chinese, into Arabic.
Oh, yes.
It's plotted its way through some of the major changes of the last 20 or so years, hasn't it?
And exactly how that happened, I don't know.
Well, let's try and unpick how it may have happened. You have espoused from the start the doctrine of non-violent struggle. But you're very clear, aren't you, that this is not an ethical choice, it's a pragmatic choice.
Yes.
Explain that to me.
People get very confused about nonviolent struggle. They're getting clearer thinking now. But they used to tie this up with pacifism or some of the quirks about Gandhi, that he was Mahatma and you have to have Mahatma, that this kind of struggle takes forever, and on down the line. And we're learning that nonviolent struggle is not something new. It's not something that's derived from ethical or religious nonviolence. It's something that people have done for many centuries, going way back to the beginning of human beings, being able to be stubborn and saying, no, I'm not going to do that, or doing something they're forbidden to do.
That violence is something which plays into the hands of the strong, of the dictators.
Yes, it's a counter-revolutionary weapon, in a way, how to destroy the revolution. Political police always put agents into resistance movements or do provocative actions, try to force the resistors to use violence, because the oppressive regimes always have great capacity for violence. And if you choose to use violence against them, that's really a stupid decision. You should do something that they have greater difficulty in counteracting and give you a greater chance to succeed.
Are there moments, though, when non-violence simply can't stop acts which would be enormously destructive? When you think about incipient acts of mass violence from a dictatorship in Nazi Germany or in Rwanda, for example, are there moments when actually violence has to be justified as a means of struggle?
If there are difficulties in using nonviolent struggle, that does not mean that violence works easily or effectively, because it frequently does not. Nonviolent struggle was used against the Nazis. In Berlin, in 1943, women married to Jews demonstrated on the streets of Berlin, 2 blocks from Gestapo headquarters, got Jewish husbands who had already been sent to concentration camps, the gas chambers, got them brought back to Berlin. Teachers in Norway under a fascist government with Nazi occupation defeated the Quisling plan for the corporate state. People do not know this history.
But that was never going to be a sufficient means of battling against the Nazis.
There was no plan to defeat the Nazis. When the Nazis came into control in Berlin, they were frightened of a general strike, a nonviolent method.
So non-violence, you're saying, can always be used, but it has to be used quickly and effectively enough.
It will not always be effective if it's not planned, if it's not prepared, if people are timid, if they aren't gutsy, and if they don't have a system of what they're going to do, if they don't know the weaknesses of the regime, if they're frightened of the regime, it's not going to work.
Well, let's explore how it might work. You list in your book 198 methods of non-violent struggle. Some of them are familiar, things like protest letters, protest meetings, strikes and so forth. But there are others that might seem slightly more recherche or baroque, things like singing, haunting officials. You talk about non-violent air raids. I'm just wondering if there's sometimes a danger with these things, that they can become almost displacement activity, that they don't cohere into something which is necessarily going to shake a dictatorship in themselves.
Of course, that's accurate, what you say. That's why you have to have a grand strategy, a preconceived analysis and program of how the various pieces of action are going to fit together and contribute to weakening the regime and empowering the population. If you don't have that, then these scattered methods will have little effect. They have some symbolism.
But they can also be enormously risky as well, can't they, for those who are taking these steps?
Any defiance of a dictatorship is risky. They won't like it.
How far do you feel, before we get on to the effectiveness of these methods, how far do you feel, though, that you have a certain personal responsibility? I mean, you mention in your book the fact that as recently as 2005 in Burma, just possession of your book could land people in prison for 7 years.
Well, not only in Burma, in Vietnam, the Vietnamese translation of this landed a prominent civil rights lawyer in jail for 5 years.
And how did that make you feel?
Proud that he was able to defy the regime and that the regime was frightened enough of this kind of struggle to pay attention.
Proud but not concerned at all that you might be landing these people in all sorts of personal trouble?
Already in personal trouble by living under an extreme dictatorship. And this is a tool by which they cannot make their situation worse, but a tool by which they can eventually bring their country to liberation.
Well, you mentioned the importance of planning, of strategy, of cooperating with others. In a country like North Korea, which is one of the most locked down, repressive countries on earth, where it's incredibly difficult for people to get together, essentially outside family units, in a way that is not sanctioned by the state, how do you possibly go about building the sorts of links and cooperation that you say are essential?
I don't know. It's a very tough case. Sometimes even the family unit is not safe because some of the members of the family may be informers to the regime. The same as happened under Nazi occupation in some countries. The regimes do not like this. That's why they are very frightened of the spread of these ideas and the citation of cases where people have demonstrated the power that they can mobilize.
Well, let's look at a country where there has been change, but arguably that there wasn't this sort of civil society, these non-governmental organizations that you say are essential. Libya, where for decades there were very few institutions that didn't bear the mark of Muammar Gaddafi. There, it did work, didn't it? That people managed to overthrow the dictatorship.
No. It started off that way, the non-violent struggle. And very quickly, there was a prominent Libyan general of the regime who supposedly defected and brought his soldiers and their guns to the resistors and said, "Here, I join the revolution." 2 weeks before that happened, Gaddafi and one of his sons predicted a civil war. Shortly after that general defected, he was killed in a rebel camp. My suspicion is he was a high-ranking agent provocateur to force the resistance into violence. And then the resistors, when they were using this, they discovered they didn't have enough weapons. That agent, that general, was killed in the rebel camp. Very suspicious. And they called in the French and the Americans and NATO to carry out the struggle. So that was not a people's struggle in the end.
But there was violence, there was internal conflict, but ultimately Gaddafi was deposed. It doesn't seem as if it fits into your...
It does not fit.
Into your model.
It does not.
And yet it was effective in a certain way.
To a certain way, that ended the Gaddafi regime. But it did not empower the population.
Well, it's a bit early to judge, isn't it?
We know that already. The population is not empowered as it is, so the people are not continuing to demonstrate when needed, as they are in Egypt, for example, where there's a different problem.
Let me ask you about the way in which you define dictatorship. You see it as a very sort of black and white issue. It seems to me that dictators are the few who keep all the power to themselves and repress the vast majority. And we can recognise models through history and around the world today. What about those dictators, though, who do have considerable popular support? I'm thinking, for example, of Nazi Germany, where Hitler did profit from the demonization of minorities and got a large level, perhaps majority support. How do you deal with those dictators?
The same way. You deny their legitimacy. It's tough in those situations. So you start small and you continue in expanding. This was done by the women in Berlin who were married to Jewish husbands, who demonstrated on the streets of Berlin. It was done in Norway, where I used to live, against the Quisling regime, the fascist regime, in the midst of Nazi occupation.
But nonetheless, you might get, in many countries, I mean, you often heard this in the Middle East. Before the Arab Spring, there was a sense from a lot of people, the received wisdom was, we may want more democracy, but we also, a lot of people liked the idea of a strong man in charge, because they said otherwise there'll be internal conflict, perhaps even civil war, competing tribes might come up against each other. So it's not necessarily all or nothing, people's views of dictatorships.
People have many views, but a lot of people in some situations conclude this regime is not something that's going to bring us satisfaction and bring us a good society and a good life. And so they join together. There's no blueprint. There's no cookie cutter. You stamp it down and you get a certain shape of a revolution and goes carries through. It's much more complicated. We have a guy planning this kind of thing. It's called self-liberation. It's a guide to how people can study and get the knowledge they need to plan their own strategies with all these differing situations and different circumstances.
When you say differing situations, different circumstances, do you accept that there are different degrees of authoritarianism?
Oh, of course. And the extremity is totalitarianism, as the Nazi system and the Stalinist system. I have speaking to these terms, I have a new dictionary, Oxford University Press published, called, it's not my title, it's called Sharp's Dictionary of Power and Struggle, Civil Resistance and Conflicts, almost 900 specific terms and definitions that are needed. You have to have very clear thinking and not sloppy, sweeping generalizations. You have to know what you're talking about.
You say you have to guard against sweeping generalizations, and I know that in the short pamphlet From Dictatorship to Democracy, you have had to, in a way, to generalize in order to make it concise. I'm just wondering if that's perhaps part of the weakness, though, of the arguments in the book. You're very dismissive about, as you see it, the dangers of negotiation.
Yes.
Is there no place for negotiation
Sometimes,
with a dictatorship?
When the regime is falling apart, the dictator wants to go to the airport to go to another country and negotiate how he can get there. Fine. But to be tricked into bargaining in the regime, you don't want half of that dictatorship to survive.
But what about a dictatorship that can see itself going, almost negotiating itself out of existence? There being some sort of halfway house.
Where does that happen?
Well, in order perhaps to ensure that it can not be run out of the country or end up in the International Criminal Court.
Dictators will not negotiate themselves out of power.
There's no historical example.
Not that I know of. You may know of one.
Do you think that in that case, if it is all or nothing, when it comes to the situation in Egypt, a lot of people are very unhappy about the influence that the army still has in Egypt?
Yes.
Do you think that in that case, people should have, for example, boycotted the recent parliamentary elections?
No. How the parliamentary elections, I don't know. But there was a major mistake made by the opposition. They did negotiate with the Mubarak regime. And they thought Mubarak had to resign. Mubarak said, I'll resign if you put the military in control after I step out. The same military that had been supporting Mubarak for decades, Mubarak and his regime came into power and control of the government in the first place. So they agreed to turn power to the military, and then control. They're very reluctant to step out of the picture politically completely.
So you see Egypt as a missed opportunity?
It's incomplete. The first half has been done. Now they face the institution that really helped Mubarak, and which they gave Mubarak control and power, and they put that in place, and they still have a problem now.
Well, let me move on to another place, and it's the place that we began, Burma. There, it's been in the democratic deep freeze, if you like, over the last several decades.
Yes.
But there have been just recently some potentially seismic shifts in terms of perhaps moves towards some sort of liberalisation.
Yes.
Do you think it is a mistake for the main opposition leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, to be talking to members of the government as she is?
Not necessarily in that situation.
But doesn't that, run counter to you saying there can be no negotiations with dictators unless you're negotiating their passage to the airport?
That would be the ideal situation, from my point of view. She is judging that situation where she knows better than I do, and she has said that there is flexibility now. That regime has been under great internal pressure for decades and great international pressure for decades, and it may be that some of those, there are what Karl Deutsch used to call cracks in the monolith. Parts of that regime may be ready to say, we shouldn't continue this.
In which case, I'm just wondering, briefly, in terms of outside pressure, as far as Burma is concerned, do you think now is the time, perhaps, for the international community to ease sanctions in order to encourage those apparently reformist parts of the government, or time still to keep the pressure on with very tight sanctions?
I would suspect it's time to keep the pressure on. But I don't know that situation in great depth, in great detail, so I'm very reluctant of giving advice for exact actions.
You've been very modest all the way through about claiming any credit for the role your pamphlet From Dictatorship to Democracy has had on all these revolutions that we've seen. But nonetheless, it has seemed to have tapped a vein. Why do you think it is now that people are paying attention?
Well, some people started paying attention quite a while ago, in Serbia, for example, where this was published in Serbian while Milosevic was still in control, and the youth organization Otpar got tutoring on this kind of struggle from Robert Helvey, a former military colonel, and learned. They got copies of The Politics of Nonviolent Action, published in 1973, and developed a strategy for conducting that struggle. It's spreading by example beyond that.
And do you see a sort of generally a movement towards more nonviolent struggle at the moment? Are we seeing a sort of a historical upsurge in revolution?
Oh, no problem. Absolutely.
Why do you think that is, then?
Because it's happening. It happened someplace. When did Poland start? When was the 1968 resistance in Czechoslovakia against the Soviet and Warsaw Pact invasion? These cases are multiplying, case after case. Little Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, where we did have deliberate influence and where one of my other books was used. Those were republics of the Soviet Union already annexed. They got out by using this kind of struggle.
Do you think, though, that this is just a sort of perpetual struggle that we're seeing between those few who want to keep power for themselves and the masses who want greater freedom, greater dignity? Or do you think there is any chance that we are going to sort of punch through to a new era where...
Not perfectly, but clearly these actions and these struggles, of which there are many more, are happening. They are not mere symbolic expressions of our frustration and dissent. They are changing the political systems of these countries. Not perfectly, still things to be gained in the future, still problems to be confronted and solved, but it's happening. And each time this happens, this gives the message to people in other parts of the world that they could do this too, potentially, if they use their heads and learn what they're doing carefully.
Gene Sharp, thank you very much for being on Hardtalk.
Thank you, sir.
This edition of Hardtalk was presented by me, Tim Franks. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.